Hi everyone, welcome back to the Tox Lab. I'm Rebecca.
I'm Rob.
Today we're going to be looking at a couple of papers looking at designer benzodiazepines, Bromazolam and Desalkylgidazepam. But before we jump in, I want to have a brief chat about what benzodiazepines are. So benzodiazepines are fairly commonly prescribed pharmaceutical drugs, typically used to treat anxiety, insomnia, and are also used to treat seizures and epilepsy. They were initially discovered accidentally, but in the 60s became available for clinical use, and they saw quite a rise in their prescription. And years later it was recognised that they have abuse potential and carry with them a risk of addiction, and then there were moves to reduce their prescription. But they still remain a fairly commonly prescribed class of drug. Today we're looking at designer benzodiazepines. So designer benzodiazepines are drugs that have been created to function as benzodiazepines, but are not necessarily pharmaceutical drugs that have ever been approved for use. We've seen a rise in these over the last few years, broadly because as controls have been put in place to try and restrict the flow of benzodiazepines, chemists have come up with ways of circumventing that control by creating chemical analogues and other compounds that act in the same way, but have a chemically different structure. Designer benzodiazepines have been emerging in a few different drug markets. They're sometimes sold as counterfeit medicines or sometimes disguised to look exactly like prescription benzodiazepines. We've also seen them emerge as contaminants in opioid supplies, so mixed in with heroin or mixed in with fentanyl, and in the States they sometimes refer to this as benzodope. So Rebecca, why don't you take us through the first paper looking at bromazolam?
Right, so this next paper is titled The Rise of Bromazolam in Post-Mortem Cases from Travis County, Texas and Surrounding Areas, 2021 to 2023. So a little bit background on bromazolam and when it started emerging. So it first emerged in 2020 after etizolam and flualprazolam, which are other novel benzodiazepines, became regulated in the US. It was initially synthesized in 1979, but was never approved for clinical use and has a similar effect to other benzos. Side effects can include loss of coordination, dizziness, drowsiness, blurred vision, slurred speech, muscle relaxation, and respiratory depression. In October 2023, bromazolam was placed under surveillance by the World Health Organization and is now recommended for international control. So this paper did a retrospective review of bromazolam positive deaths in Travis County, Texas, and 46 surrounding counties, covering the period of the 1st of January 2021 to the 31st of December 2023. And in that time they had 7,129 post-mortem cases where they did toxicology, and 112 of those were positive for bromazolam, which is about 1.6%.
Okay, so it's become fairly prevalent in the post-mortem data set there. Has it changed over that time?
Yes, they noted a statistically significant increase in the number of cases in general from 2021 to 2023, and a 7.5-fold increase in bromazolam-related deaths rather than just bromazolam detected at postmortem.
Okay, so not only did its prevalence go up, but actually its significance within these cases also increased. Rebecca, why don't you tell us some stats from this paper?
So they looked at bromazolam-positive cases and how they were classed. So 89% of them were classed as accidental deaths, 6% were homicides, 4% suicides, and there was one natural death. And it was first identified in these cases in April 2021. The majority of people who were positive for bromazolam were men, 71% of those were men, with a median age of 31. 57% of them were white, which kind of represents the area they were looking at, so it wasn't biased towards one race or another.
I want to drill into the homicides very briefly. Death by bromazolam?
No, I think it's just bromazolam detected in homicide cases.
This probably then just represents just how prevalent this compound was, rather than necessarily being directly involved in homicide cases. This does really just show us how complex post-mortem toxicology can be, can't it? Because we've suddenly seen this rise of this new compound. Its prevalence has grown quite significantly, quite fast. Do we have any indication on what any of these numbers mean? Is there any interpretation that comes with this?
I don't think they necessarily talked about the sorts of concentrations they were seeing and what they would class as fatal or not. There was one case where bromazolam was deemed to be the cause of death and was found at a concentration of 23 nanograms per mil. But we see that quite often in multi-drug toxicity, so I don't know whether that necessarily represents a fatal level.
Looking at the rest of that, they've reported in their entire data set a range between 21 and 220 micrograms a litre, and this single case seems to fit at the bottom end of that. So there's obviously quite a lot of overlap with the polydrug cases.
It is worth noting that 220 nanograms per mil was in a muscle specimen and not in femoral blood.
Oh, well, that's basically meaningless for comparison in that case.
Yeah, 70% of them were between 40 and 100 nanograms per mil.
Okay. It possibly indicates that muscle could be a good matrix for detecting bromazolam, but that's a rabbit hole for another day.
Yeah, definitely. So out of the 112 cases they looked at, they split it down into those where bromazolam was thought to be contributory and those that weren't. So 81% of those were thought to be contributory and 99% of those were accidental, and they didn't follow up on the 21 other cases where it was deemed to be unrelated, so those included the homicides and things like that.
Things where there were some other clear cause of death.
Exactly. What's quite interesting is 99% of the positive cases had other drugs present. Fentanyl was detected in 69% of those, amphetamine was detected in 40%, and 35% of those had other benzos like alprazolam, diazepam, clonazepam, which was detected using its metabolite 8-aminoclonazepam.
That's interesting. So, and that's kind of a pattern we see with the pharmaceutical benzodiazepines as well. They rarely cause fatal intoxication on their own, but they can be a significant contributing factor in the presence of other compounds, typically alcohol or opioids. So this is what we're seeing here with that huge co-detection with fentanyl. It's not necessarily that the bromazolam itself is particularly toxic, but it could be exacerbating the effects of the fentanyl.
And that's the thing, the drugs that were co-detected with bromazolam over time change. So the fentanyl co-detections increase over that time period by 13%, with the peak detections being at Q4 2022. And that does seem, I think, peters off in 2023.
And that's following some degrees of international control, possibly.
Possibly.
I think the co-detection with fentanyl's interesting. I think it's been recognised that it is emerging as a contaminant in the opioid supply itself. So rather than being found in illicit or counterfeit pharmaceuticals, although it clearly does emerge as those as well, bromazolam has been cropping up as an additive to fentanyl, presumably to potentiate its effect and essentially mean that you can get a similar sedation effect with less fentanyl, but obviously it carries increased risk of significant and fatal respiratory depression.
Along that same vein, they do talk about the risk of ODs when bromazolam's combined with stimulants, which seem to be a popular class of drugs that were co-detected, because you've got an increased risk of you doing more stimulants because you've got that sort of depressive effect.
That's interesting.
And then you're at an increased risk of like myocardial injury and things like that.
In other words, if you've got benzos on board, people are taking more stimulants. That's interesting. Okay, that's a really interesting angle.
Yeah, and it seemed to be the cocaine-amphetamine co-detections were quite steady, at like 60 to 70% of cases.
Still seems quite high.
It does, yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, that's a really interesting paper. How does this compare to the UK context?
So there was a study done that looked at 96 post-mortem cases where bromazolam was detected. None of these contained fentanyl, which I think is quite reflective of the different sorts of opioids that the UK use compared to the US. Fentanyl is quite popular in the US. But in terms of co-detections, cocaine, gabapentinoids and diazepam were the sorts of drugs that were co-detected alongside bromazolam in the UK dataset. So it's a kind of similar to what they've seen, but I don't think they saw any gabapentinoids co-detected.
So a similar polydrug context, but perhaps different substances being mixed with the UK. Interesting. Okay, great. So let's move on to our second paper. And this is a paper looking at a similar but different compound. This compound is called Desalkylgidazepam. Why don't you introduce us a little bit into that, Rebecca?
So Desalkylgidazepam is a metabolite of gidazepam.
So what's gidazepam?
So gidazepam is a benzodiazepine that has been approved for clinical use in the Ukraine and Russia, commonly prescribed for anxiety, alcohol withdrawal and migraines, and it's recognised it's got quite a bit of abuse potential, so I don't think it's prescribed anywhere else. So yeah, desalkylgidazepam is a metabolite, but has also been appearing as a drug in its own right.
So it's a breakdown product of gidazepam,
Exactly.
but it's been emerging as a drug in isolation.
Yeah, this study looks at desalkylgidazepam detections in British Columbia. Desalkylgidazepam was first detected in Canada in the drug supply in April 2022.
So a relatively new compound.
Yeah.
Why don't you jump in and take us through some of the stats from the paper?
So they looked at 63 post-mortem blood cases where desalkylgidazepam was detected between April and December 2022. Some general stats, so 77% of the cases were men with an average age of about 45. So kind of similar to what we were seeing with the Bromazolam paper earlier on, similar sort of demographics affected. They noted an average concentration of desalkylgidazepam of 42.2 nanograms per ml with a median concentration of 24.5. And again, polydrug use was found in the majority of cases. Fentanyl, caffeine, methamphetamine, amphetamine, bromazolam, interestingly, and naloxone were all up there as the most commonly detected drugs in those desalkylgidazepam positive cases.
So very similar picture to what we saw with the bromazolam data, except it's yet a different chemical. The concentrations detected quite similar as well, aren't they? Putting it in the similar sort of concentration range.
Yeah.
Do we know much about the pharmacokinetics of desalkylgidazepam? How does it compare to other benzodiazepines?
So it appears that desalkylgidazepam has a 600 times greater affinity for the GABA A receptor compared to its parent drug, gidazepam, which I thought was quite interesting. It's got a similar half-life that's comparable with other designer benzos. It's quite a long-acting benzo with a half-life of about 86 hours.
It's quite a long time,
It's a
isn't
decent time.
It means if you take a dose of this drug, 86 hours later, the level is only half what it was. It hangs around for quite some time.
It does. What was interesting in contrast with the Bromazolam paper, 96.8% of cases had a fentanyl co-detected. So it still seems to be a very popular drug to mix with benzos.
And do we know if this is being mixed in with opioids or whether this is being pushed as counterfeit medication?
I don't know, I'm sure it's a bit of both. I'm sure it's a contaminant in what people believe to be traditional benzodiazepines, like diazepam and alprazolam, that they're buying online. But maybe it is being mixed in with fentanyl, I don't know.
So let's, bearing that paper in mind for a second, then look at the UK picture. Desalkylgidazepam, I believe, has been detected in the UK in a number of cases.
I know it's definitely been detected in drug seizures. I think it was first detected in like April 2022. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I'll take your word for it. I've just had a quick look at Wedinos. Wedinos is a charity that does drug checking in the UK, anonymous drug checking. And it looks like desalkylgidazepam has been detected there going back as early as... Oh, wow, there's a detection here from 2022, which surprised me. But very often it is being detected in counterfeit benzodiazepines. So being sold as benzodiazepines, but perhaps not necessarily the benzodiazepine you think you are purchasing. So it's definitely here in the UK. One to keep our eye out for sure. Do we know anything about its clinical effects versus sort of bromazolam and traditional ones? It may well be that there's not a lot between them.
I don't think there is.
Well, very interesting. So I think both these papers really show us just the complexities of toxicology, but also just how varied things out there are in terms of drug markets.
Yeah, it is really variable, and like from our experience at least, we've seen plenty of bromazolam cases where they've been co-detected with other benzodiazepines and with opioids, but we, as of yet, haven't seen any desalkylgidazepam that we've confirmed.
No, one to keep our eye out for sure, though, because it does sound like it is here. And as you said, maybe now we're starting to see bromazolam come under international control. Maybe this is next.
And it is surprising how long bromazolam has hung around for compared to other novel benzodiazepines, because they seem to chop and change quite a bit. So maybe bromazolam's quite favourable with users.
It's possible, yeah. It's certainly been a number of years since we first sort of saw bromazolam.
So yeah, maybe it will disappear off when it comes under official international control, or maybe it will just hang around a little bit. I don't know. Have to watch this space and find out.
So what's the take-home message?
Novel benzos are quite common in post-mortem toxicology. We do see quite a few of them, and they are often detected alongside other drugs rather than just being a novel benzo on their own. It'd be quite interesting to see how many you get that are just, for example, bromazolam only detections.
I'm not sure I can think of a single case
No.
off the top of my head from my experience. I could be
No, not that
wrong.
we've seen. Obviously, there was that one in that paper, but out of all those cases, 99% of them were detected alongside other drugs. So
I think the authors do even acknowledge there may have been other undetected substances in that paper. Well, I mean, and that logic applies to every case, right?
completely. If you look,
Yeah.
you can't look for absolutely everything, so there's always a chance you're missing something.
I think the other sort of take-home message from me from this really is that even when you think you're testing for all the benzos, a new one could appear, and there are analytical challenges that come with this constantly evolving drug market. If you're using a mass spec, you've got to look specifically for the right compounds, and there are still tests in use that test for groups of drugs. For example, immunoassay testing for benzodiazepines. We don't know how well or how badly these novel benzos will cross-react, so you haven't got entire confidence that a negative result is negative. It could just be that the particular benzo doesn't react very well.
No, completely true, but from our sort of experience, you do often get a positive immunoassay hit for the novel benzos we are looking for, like bromazolam. So it does kind of point you in the direction there is something there, you just don't know what it is.
It's true. So there is possibly still some merit in the immunoassay.
Yeah. At least then you can make sure that you're checking for as many benzos as you can to try and work out which one it is. Obviously, you still might be missing some if there's one that you've not got in your library, but that's a risk with any drug that we're looking at.
Yeah, very true. Okay, I think we should wrap it up there. Thank you everybody for listening. Do give us a like and a follow if you haven't already. We do appreciate it, and do drop us comments as well.
Yes, so you can follow us on Instagram. We are the_tox_lab, and we are also on Twitter. So feel free to tweet away
X.
at us. What X? I'm still not going to get over it. It's will always be Twitter to me. But yeah, you can give us a follow there. We might end up being on TikTok at some point. You never know. Yeah, do feel free to follow us on Instagram. Send us messages if you've got any paper recommendations or things you'd like us to cover. We're always looking to hear from you guys. So yeah, hope you all have a great week.
Have a great week, everyone.
Bye!